Kalen stood. His legs were locked, tremors rattling through his frame like a failing reactor, but he refused to buckle. At his feet, the 3 Kyber stalkers were little more than heaps of twitching chrome and scorched meat. Blood, thick and alarmingly red, pulsed from the gash in his side, soaking into the pristine deck plating of the Archon's private sanctum. He didn't look at his wounds. He only looked at Vespera, his eyes hard and unyielding. Would you have bled for a master who bought you for the price of a spare cooling rod? Or would you have let the blades fall? You'll want to hear how this ends, because Kalen wasn't just a slave. The bitter, metallic aftertaste of a standard-issue grade 4 nutrient sludge had been the only thing on our minds 12 hours earlier. We were standing in the humid, sulfur-choked air of the Gilded Maw, watching Archon Vespera pick through the galaxy's wreckage. As her elite security detail, our job was to look formidable and stay silent while she sought a replacement for the guard we had lost in the Crimson Nebula. The market was a cacophony of misery. High-pitched whines from neural disruptors echoed off the rusted iron pylons, keeping the inventory docile. Vespera moved with a predatory grace, her secondary eyelids snapping shut in a sharp, involuntary stress blink every time a vendor offered her a perfectly broken specimen. She didn't want broken. She wanted a shield that could think. We watched her pass by the hulking Thraxian warriors and the lithe, multi-limbed assassins of the Inner Rim. They all had the same look, the vacant, glassy stare of creatures who had accepted their chains. The Archon's tail lashed with irritation, a sign of her growing impatience that made the surrounding vendors recoil. Then she stopped. In a cage designed for smaller, domestic pets sat a human. He was small compared to us, perhaps 2/3 our height, and his skin lacked the reinforced chitinous scales of a proper soldier. But he wasn't sitting. He was standing in the center of the cramped enclosure, his back straight, watching the crowds with a calculating gaze that felt like a physical weight. "This one," Vespera said, her voice a low vibration in her chest. A Terran. The lead guard, Kraelv, clicked his mandibles in a gesture of suppressed amusement. "Archon, they are fragile. They have no natural armor, no venom, and their reaction times are governed by chemical electrical pulses. It is a waste of credits." A shadow fell over the cage as Drax approached. He was Vespera's chief rival in the solar hegemony, a massive being whose own security detail consisted of 6 armed giants. Drax looked down at the human and let out a guttural bark of a laugh. "Buying a pet, Vespera?" Drax sneered, his own chromatophores shifting to a mocking shade of pale yellow. "I suppose he can clean the boots of your real soldiers. Or perhaps he can serve as a snack for my hounds if he fails to entertain." The human, Kalen, didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Drax. He kept his eyes on Vespera, a silent communication passing between them that we couldn't decode. Because logic didn't account for spite. "I'll take him," Vespera told the slaver, ignoring Drax entirely. 500 credits. It was a pittance, the price of a refurbished power cell. Drax laughed again, a wet, rattling sound, as we shackled the human and led him toward the boarding ramp of the Obsidian Aegis. We expected him to struggle or plead. Instead, he walked with a quiet, terrifying composure. Once aboard, the human was assigned a small berth near the secondary engine room. We watched him through the internal sensors, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He didn't break. Instead, he did something we found baffling. He paced. He didn't pace like a caged animal, however. He paced like a surveyor. From our station in the security hub, we watched his eyes. They were constantly moving, tracking the seams of the bulkheads, the placement of the internal turrets, and the specific interval of the guard rotations. "He's memorizing the layout," I whispered to Kraelv. "To what end?" Kraelv replied, his secondary heart thudding a slow, rhythmic beat of indifference. "He is unarmed. He has no clearance. Even if he escaped his room, he would be vaporized by the first plasma arc trap he encountered." Beneath the steady hum of the ship's sublight engines, a tiny, repetitive sound began to grate on our nerves. Tink, tink, tink. It was a loose fastener on a ventilation grate in the corridor outside Kalen's berth. To us, it was a maintenance ticket to be ignored. To the human, it was a metronome. Hours into the night cycle, the Obsidian Aegis was a tomb of shadows and neon light. We were monitoring the perimeter when the first sensor ghost appeared. Then another. Three Kyber stalkers, high-end organic metal hybrids designed for stealth, had bypassed the external hull sensors. They weren't coming for the ship. They were coming for the Archon. They entered through the ventilation shafts, their liquid metal bodies sliding through the narrow ducts with terrifying silence. Our tactical overlays remained green. Our biosensors reported nothing. The invaders were ghosts in the machine. But they weren't ghosts to the human. Kalen had stopped his pacing. He was standing by his door, his ear pressed against the cold metal. He had heard the tink-tink-tink of the vent fastener stop. Gone. The silence that followed was the only warning he needed. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have armor. But as the first assassin dropped from the ceiling in the corridor outside his berth, Kalen didn't scream for help. He reached for the heavy, magnetic lock tray that had carried his evening meal. The scale gap between a human and a Kyber stalker is a death sentence on paper. The stalkers are faster, stronger, and equipped with monomolecular blades. But as the stalker turned its head toward the Archon's quarters, Kalen slammed his body against his own door, overriding the emergency manual release with a sheer, desperate burst of Terran grit that should have snapped his collarbone. The door hissed open. The assassin spun, its blade arm whistling through the air. The stalker's blade didn't hit air. It bit deep into Kalen's side, the monomolecular edge shearing through skin and muscle with the ease of a hot wire through wax. We watched through the security feed, our internal cooling fans whirring at maximum capacity as the human didn't collapse. Instead, he leaned into the wound, using the assassin's own momentum to trap the blade arm against his ribs while he swung the heavy magnetic lock tray with both hands. The metal slammed into the stalker's sensory cluster, shattering the delicate optics in a spray of blue fluid. He didn't stop there. He was a whirlwind of barehanded violence, a creature of bone and rage fighting a machine of steel and logic. Because humans don't understand math. If they did, he would have known that his blood loss had already reached the critical threshold for consciousness. Yet, he moved, his calculating gaze narrowed to slits as he intercepted the second and third assassins in the narrow throat of the corridor. The air in the hallway grew thick with the smell of ozone from a short-circuited wall panel, a sharp, electric scent that masked the copper tang of the human's blood. He used the environment as a weapon, slamming a stalker's head into a live power conduit and holding it there until the machine's chassis buckled and sparked. By the time we arrived with our heavy neural disruptors, the fight was over. And now, in the dim light of the Archon's quarters, the silence was heavier than the ship's gravity. Kalen stood amidst the smoldering remains of three genetically engineered assassins, blood pouring from his side, as he forced his trembling legs to stay locked upright before his shocked commander. We stood behind her, our weapons lowered, watching the human's hands shake as he refused to reach for the medical kit. "You could have stayed in your berth," Vespera whispered, her voice devoid of its usual Archon authority. "The bypass code for your collar was linked to my vitals. If I had died, you would have been a free man by the time we reached the next port." Kalen looked at her, a faint, bloody smirk touching his lips. "Freedom earned through cowardice is just another set of chains," he rasped, the words wheezing through a punctured lung. He didn't fall. In the days that followed, the ship's chief medical officer, a spindly creature of logic named Phoros, stood before Hegemon Drax and the Archon, holding a data slate that seemed to tremble in his grip. Drax had come to demand a sanctioned honor duel, claiming Kalen's interference had robbed the hegemony of a clean resolution to the security breach. "You are asking me to permit a duel between a hegemon and a pet," Vespera said, her voice like grinding ice. "He is no pet," Phoros interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "Archon, I have analyzed the human's combat data. While our bodies rely on regulated hormonal cascades, humans possess a system of fight or flight that bypasses logic entirely, flooded by a chemical called adrenaline that allows them to ignore terminal damage, exert mechanical force far beyond their muscle density, and process time at a rate that makes our tactical overlays look like stagnant water." Drax scoffed, his scales rattling. "It is a fluke of biology. A glitch. It is a variable that refuses to add up," Phoros countered. "In a galaxy governed by the swarm mind's hive mind chaos, this Terran grit is the only thing I have seen that doesn't follow a predictable curve." The duel took place in the central hangar, a vast, hollow space that smelled of spent fuel and cold metal. Drax was twice Kalen's size, armored in heavy, overlapping scales that could turn a laser pulse. The human was wrapped in medical tape, his movements stiff. We watched from the upper tiers, expecting a slaughter. Drax charged. He was a mountain of momentum, a predictable, crushing force. Kalen didn't meet him head-on. He waited until the last microsecond, then dropped to the floor, sliding through the oil-slicked scale gap between the hegemon's heavy footfalls. He didn't use a blade. He used a heavy-duty cargo tether, looping it around Drax's neck and using the hegemon's own forward velocity to snap his head back with a sickening crack. The hegemon fell. The human stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and raw. "Kill me," Drax wheezed, his pride shattered. Kalen looked up at the observation deck, toward the eternal matriarch who sat in silent judgment. "I don't kill for sport," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "But my world, Terra Prime, is currently in the Swarm Mind's path. Give us an alliance, and I will show your soldiers how to fight without their sensors." The alliance was forged not in ink, but in fire. Months later, the human led the charge into the heart of the Swarm Mind's territory. It was a suicide burn, a mission with a 0% probability of return. We watched the human's small ship dive into the flagship's core, a tiny spark of defiance against a sun-sized nightmare. The explosion that followed was a blinding white flower that tore through the hive coordination of the enemy fleet. Against all mathematical odds, Vespera herself flew the recovery craft into the wreckage. She found him in a pocket of failing life support, his ship a twisted skeleton of metal. "Why?" she asked as she pulled him into the airlock. "Because someone had to," Kalen replied, his eyes closing. He didn't die that day, and the galaxy didn't stay the same. The Gilded Maw was dismantled, its rusted pylons melted down to build the first joint species embassy. The old laws of the solar hegemony were replaced by a galactic compact where humans and the hegemony stood as equal, star-tearing partners. Kalen stood on the observation deck of the new station, looking out at the Crimson Nebula. His neck was bare, the skin where the ownership collar had once bitten into his flesh now smooth and healed. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had finally finished a long day's work. Vespera walked up beside him, her secondary eyelids blinking in the soft light of the station's interior. "The matriarch wants to know what you require for the next phase of the reconstruction," she said. Kalen watched a transport ship dock below them, its engines humming a low, steady note of peace. A real breakfast would be a start. A single, golden sunlight glint off the polished, empty curve of his throat.